Have you ever walked into your childhood home and felt just for a moment like you were peeking into someone else's life? My name is Madeline Carter, and if you've ever found yourself clutching old memories while the world rearranges itself around you, then maybe my story will sound a little like yours too. They say time heals all wounds, but when my mother passed away, time just seemed to slow down. The house grew quieter. Shadows stretched longer in the hallway. I was 12 years old, but overnight I felt as if I'd aged decades. Grief has a way of shrinking your universe until even the softest moments carry a kind of ache, like the smell of cinnamon in the kitchen or the faded shape of your mother's handwriting on a note left behind. The little things, the ones you never thought you'd miss, suddenly become everything. Life, of course, moves on. The world keeps spinning, neighbors wave as if nothing has changed, and people keep telling you how strong you are, though some days you'd give anything just to fall apart. My dad did his best. He made me eggs in the morning, told me about his work, tried to fill the empty spaces at our dinner table with laughter. But the laughter always felt a bit too loud, like it was covering up a song we'd all forgotten the words to. The truth is, we both learned to live around our grief, pretending we could patch over the gaps with routines and polite smiles. In those first months, I became very good at pretending. I thought if I acted okay, maybe one day it would be true. It wasn't long before someone new stepped into our lives. Vanessa Reed. She was all confidence and bright colors, the kind of woman who always seemed to know exactly what to say. I remember the first time I saw her standing in our entryway, in a sunflower yellow dress, holding a bouquet, she said was just a little sunshine for the house. Dad's voice softened around her, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. He told me gently but firmly that he needed me to try to give this new chapter a chance. So I did what so many kids do. I tried. I carried Vanessa's boxes up the stairs, helped her unpack her favorite teacups, nodded along as she rearranged our furniture to let in more light. All the while, I wondered if letting in the light meant erasing the past. Looking back, it's funny how quickly a place can change. My mother's flowered curtains disappeared, replaced by sheer linen panels. The family photos on the mantel were swapped for abstract paintings. Vanessa said they made the room feel bigger. Even the backyard vegetable patch where my mom used to plant sunflowers and tomatoes was transformed into a neat little meditation patio. Growing your own food is so much work. Vanessa laughed one afternoon, kneeling in spotless yoga pants as she placed smooth white stones in the dirt. Sometimes I think she honestly wanted to help us heal. Sometimes I think she just wanted to start over. Either way, the home I'd known was slipping away little by little, and I didn't know how to stop it. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, standing just out of frame, watching other people fill the space you used to call your own, then you'll understand what came next. I became the model stepdaughter. I wore the dresses Vanessa picked out for me, smiled for photos at her work parties, listened politely as her friends gushed about how mature I was for my age. At night, though, I'd curl up under my mother's old quilt and listen for a voice I'd never hear again. I told myself that I could make it work, that all families had to adjust. But what I didn't realize was that sometimes when you spend all your energy holding everyone else together, you start to unravel from the inside out. This isn't just a story about loss or change, though. It's about what happens when secrets are buried beneath polite conversations and carefully tended gardens. It's about the ways we try to protect the people we love and the truths that eventually find their way into the light. My journey isn't unique, but it is mine, a path paved with grief, courage, and the kind of quiet determination you only find when you have nowhere left to run. So if you're ready, let's step inside this story together, because sometimes the only way to reclaim your place in the world is to start by telling the truth, even if your voice shakes, and even if you have to find it all over again. Grief has its own weather. In the weeks after my mother's funeral, Boston seemed stuck under a gray, endless sky. Our house, once alive with laughter and little routines, felt too big for just the two of us. I remember tiptoeing through the living room in the early mornings, half expecting to hear Mom humming by the window, her hands busy with flowers she'd picked from the garden. But the only sound was the refrigerator humming like it was trying to fill the silence. Grief didn't come all at once. It crept in softly through forgotten coffee mugs, empty seats at the dinner table, and the quiet ache of unanswered questions. Sometimes I'd find one of Mom's sweaters tucked in a drawer, still holding a trace of her perfume, and for a moment it felt like she was just in the next room, ready to call me in for breakfast. But the moment always faded. My father did his best to hold us together. He still left notes for me on the counter. "Have a good day." Mad's written in the neat, careful handwriting he reserved for special occasions. Some mornings he tried to make Mom's signature pancakes, flipping them with nervous concentration, always a little too brown on one side. We fell into a new routine, him at the stove, me at the table pretending things could be normal. But we both knew something was missing. After school, I'd wander the neighborhood on my own, stopping by the bakery where the owner, Mrs. Patel, always saved the last blueberry muffin for me. She never asked questions, just pressed the warm bag into my hand and squeezed my shoulder. Small kindnesses like that felt enormous, tiny life preservers in a world that suddenly felt too deep to swim. I spent a lot of time thinking about how families change when someone leaves. At school, my friends tiptoed around the subject of my mom. I could see them wanting to ask, but not knowing how. Sometimes they'd whisper in the hallway, unsure if they should invite me to birthday parties or sleepovers. It's strange when you lose someone, people act like you might break if they get too close. The truth was, I wanted nothing more than to be seen to be treated like myself again, not just the girl whose mom died. I envied classmates who complained about their moms nagging them about homework or chores. I'd have given anything for one more reminder to clean my room or take out the trash. Loss has a way of sharpening your awareness of what really matters, the little things, the ordinary routines you once took for granted. There were nights I lay awake, wishing for the sound of my mom's voice at my bedroom door. Sometimes I tried to talk to her, whispering into the darkness, hoping the words would find their way somewhere. I didn't know how to ask my dad for help with the big feelings. He seemed so tired, and I was afraid of adding to his worry. So I bottled it up. That's something no one tells you about grief. It's heavy, but it's also invisible. It sits in your chest, pressing down until it's hard to breathe, but the world expects you to keep moving. Keep showing up, keep smiling. I got good at putting on a brave face at school, answering I'm fine when teachers asked how I was doing. The truth was messier, lonelier, but I didn't know how to say it out loud. When you're young, you expect the adults to have all the answers. But watching my dad struggle showed me that grown-ups grieve too. Some days he'd get lost in old photo albums, tracing his finger along the edges of wedding pictures and birthday cards. Other days, he'd throw himself into work, coming home late and smelling like rain and printer ink. I tried to help where I could, washing dishes, folding laundry, remembering to lock the door at night. We both became a little older that year, learning to fill roles we hadn't chosen. I heard once that grief is love with nowhere to go. I think that's true. The love we used to pour into my mom had to find new outlets sometimes in awkward hugs, sometimes in quiet evenings spent side by side saying nothing at all. If you're listening and you felt that kind of ache, know that you're not alone. Grief isn't a problem to solve. It's a companion you learn to carry. Some days it's a whisper. Other days it's a storm. There's no right way to mourn, no timeline to follow. I wish someone had told me that sooner. Instead, I learned it piece by piece from the way Mrs. Patel wrapped my muffin, from the notes my father left, from the gentle patience of a neighbor who let me help water her garden, even when I didn't want to talk. Every small kindness helped stitch my heart back together, one thread at a time. One afternoon, a few months after the funeral, I found myself wandering into my mother's old greenhouse behind the house. The air inside was heavy with the scent of earth and rosemary sunlight streaming through dusty windows. My mom had loved that space, a place where things could bloom, no matter how cold it was outside. As I stood among the tangled vines and broken pots, I realized that grief was a little like tending a garden. You pull up what's dead, you water what remains, and with patience, new things might start to grow. It wouldn't be the same, but it could still be beautiful in its own way. Looking back, I see now how those early months shaped everything that followed. The pain of losing my mother never really disappeared. It just changed shape, teaching me to pay attention to what survived. I learned to treasure the ordinary Sunday mornings with pancakes, a note on the counter, the way the city smelled after rain. I also learned the importance of letting yourself feel what you feel without apology. Trying to rush past sadness only makes it linger longer. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that your heart is broken and ask for a little help holding the pieces. That lesson stayed with me even as the seasons turned, and our home began to shift in ways I could never have predicted. Because as I would soon discover, change wasn't finished with us yet. My father, in his own search for healing, would bring someone new into our lives, a woman whose arrival would test the boundaries of love, loyalty, and belonging. I couldn't have known then how much her presence would alter the course of my story. But as spring returned to Boston and the garden outside began to wake from its long winter sleep, I realized that even in the midst of loss, life finds a way to begin again. And so as sunlight crept across the kitchen floor one morning, I heard my dad humming softly a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. When I looked up, he was standing at the door with a hopeful smile, introducing me to Vanessa Reed for the very first time. In that instant, I understood the chapters of our lives rarely end where we expect. Sometimes a new story starts with a single quiet knock at the door. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in when someone new moves into your life, a silence that's not quite empty but expectant, like a breath held between two verses of an unfinished song. That's how it felt the first week Vanessa Reed moved in. My dad, whose world had seemed so small since Mom passed away, suddenly became lighter, brighter. He laughed a little more, started cooking dinners that went beyond scrambled eggs, and played old jazz records in the evening, as he and Vanessa unpacked boxes. At first I tried to convince myself that this was good. Change, everyone said, could be healthy. But in my chest, a knot of worry refused to loosen. Vanessa was everything my mother wasn't, at least on the surface. She wore bold colors and jewelry that caught. The light smiled with perfect teeth and called everyone sweetheart whether she'd known them for a decade or a day. Her perfume lingered in the air like summer evenings, and her laugh bounced off the kitchen walls. It would have been easy to dislike her, but I could see the way she tried. She brought home bakery croissants, left sticky notes on the fridge. "Good luck on your math test, Mads," and asked about my favorite TV shows, nodding along as if she'd watched them too. She was learning how to belong, even if the script was foreign. Yet every small act of kindness seemed to highlight what was missing. I noticed little things first, how my mother's handmade curtains vanished, replaced by linen panels that let in too much morning sun. How family photos were swapped for art prints with swirling brushstrokes that opened up the space. Vanessa filled every corner with something new, vases, scented candles, yoga mats, until the house felt less like ours and more like a magazine page, carefully arranged but unfamiliar. Once I came home to find her packing up my mother's gardening tools. "Just making room for new beginnings," she explained with a bright smile, not seeing the way my hands curled into fists behind my back. It's strange how grief can mix with guilt, especially when everyone around you wants to move forward. I wanted to be happy for my dad. I wanted to like Vanessa. But there was a quiet resentment building, a feeling that I was being nudged out of my own story. She never raised her voice or demanded obedience. Instead, she orchestrated small changes with gentle insistence. "Let's paint your room a fun color," or "Wouldn't it be great to host your friends for a movie night?" Each suggestion meant well, but together they felt like a tide pulling me further from the world I recognized. I learned from experience that blended families are more common than people realize, especially in America. Most of my classmates had stories of step-parents, half-siblings, or summers spent splitting time between houses. There were happy endings and horror stories in equal measure. My friend Julia once confided in me, "It took years before I called my stepdad Dad. And sometimes I still feel like a guest in my own house." Her honesty made me braver, more willing to admit that I wasn't alone in feeling awkward, even a little lost. The truth is, loving someone new doesn't erase the love you lost, but it can feel at first like it's supposed to. Vanessa tried hard to include me. She planned girls' days with shopping trips I endured, smiling as she held up dresses I'd never choose for myself. At dinner parties, she introduced me as our daughter to her friends, who would nod and comment on how grown up I seemed, never quite meeting my eyes. Sometimes Vanessa would pause outside my bedroom door, uncertain, and ask if I wanted to talk. More often than not, I said I was busy with homework, and she would leave quietly, shoulders tense. I could sense the pressure she felt walking the thin line between stepmother and stranger, desperate to be accepted without overstepping. One evening after a particularly long day, I found Vanessa in the kitchen rearranging the spice cabinet. She turned holding a jar of cinnamon and said, "Your mom must have loved to cook." There was a gentleness in her voice I hadn't heard before. For a moment, the air between us softened, and I almost told her about the time Mom and I tried to bake an apple pie, how we burned the crust and laughed so hard we cried. But the memory was too precious, too raw. Instead, I nodded and helped her alphabetize the jars, finding comfort in the quiet rhythm of something so simple. If you've ever found yourself torn between the past and the present, you'll know how difficult it is to let go without feeling like you're betraying someone you loved. Vanessa wasn't trying to erase my mother, but sometimes it felt that way, like every new tradition came at the expense of an old one. I wished more than anything that someone would tell me how to balance old grief and new hope, how to welcome change without losing myself in the process. Looking back, I see now that both Vanessa and I were performing a delicate dance. She wanted to prove her worth, to bring happiness back to our home, while I clung to what was left of the world I'd known. It wasn't anyone's fault that it hurt. We were both navigating uncharted territory, learning as we went stumbling over invisible lines drawn by memory and longing. In America, so many families are stitched together from different stories, hoping for a happy ending, even when the first chapters are hard to read. One small lesson I carry from those days is that love cannot be rushed. Real trust grows slowly, watered by patience and small acts of respect. It's not enough to rearrange furniture or plan fun outings. What matters most is listening truly, listening to what's unspoken, the fears, the attachments, the little rituals that make a house a home. If you're building a new family, let time do its work. Healing isn't linear, and neither is love. As autumn settled in and the trees outside began to burn with color, the house started to feel different, not better or worse, just different. Vanessa and my dad made plans for the holidays, talking excitedly about inviting friends and trying new recipes. I watched from the sidelines, unsure of my place in this new arrangement. It would be a while before I found the courage to speak up for what mattered to me, to draw boundaries and ask for space to remember my mother in my own way. But change was happening whether I was ready or not. The holidays would bring new challenges, new traditions, and unexpected moments of grace. And deep down, I began to sense that this was only the beginning, that the real test of family was still to come, hidden just beyond the comfort of routine. Sometimes it's in the seasons of upheaval that we learn who we are and what we truly need to hold on to. There's a strange kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending everything is fine. In the months after Vanessa moved in, I perfected my role as the easy daughter, the one who always smiled in family photos, who said thank you and please and never made a scene. I wore the clothes Vanessa picked out, tucked my hair the way she liked, and listened to her talk about weekend plans, as if I actually cared which friends she wanted to invite over. On the surface, our family looked seamless dinners with candles, polite conversation, laughter that sounded just convincing enough. But underneath it all was a kind of quiet fatigue, a weariness that seeped into my bones and made every day feel a little heavier. People at school started to notice the change. I got good grades, joined clubs, said I'm fine when teachers asked how things were at home. My friend Julia, who had been through her parents' divorce, pulled me aside one day and said, "You know, you don't have to keep it together all the time." I shrugged, not knowing how to explain that sometimes pretending is the only way to survive. It's something I saw in my father, too. He threw himself into work, coming home with tired eyes but a hopeful voice. The house was neat, our clothes were clean, dinner was always on the table. On paper, we were doing everything right. But grief and loneliness have a way of slipping into the cracks, no matter how carefully you try to seal them. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the distant sound of Vanessa's laughter in the living room. I would curl up beneath my mother's quilt and whisper old stories into the darkness, little memories I was afraid to lose. The world kept moving, but I was stuck in a loop of what used to be. Even simple things like grocery shopping or watching TV felt unfamiliar. Vanessa favored organic brands and cooking shows, while I longed for the comfort food and sitcoms my mother loved. Sometimes I wondered if anyone really saw me. Vanessa's friends often commented on how mature I was for my age, praising my manners, as if good behavior could replace genuine connection. At school events, she introduced me as our daughter, smiling wide for the cameras. I smiled back, but it felt like playing a part in someone else's movie, a role I hadn't auditioned for. Even my father seemed to drift away, grateful that I was adjusting so well. In truth, I was learning to disappear. Blended families, I came to realize, are a patchwork quilt, beautiful, but not always warm. Every piece is stitched together by necessity, each with its own pattern and history. I met kids at school whose families looked like mine, step-parents, half-siblings, holidays, split between households. Some, like my friend Brian, had found a sense of belonging. Others, like Julia, felt permanently on the outside. It's not about who's under your roof. Brian once told me it's about who makes you feel at home. I wanted that more than anything, but wishing for comfort didn't make it come any faster. I began to fill my days with activities. I joined the drama club, took extra math classes, and volunteered at the library on weekends. If I was busy, I didn't have to think so much about the empty places inside me. Still, there were moments when the loneliness broke through at the end of a play rehearsal when everyone else was picked up by two parents, or late at night when I heard Vanessa and my father whispering in the kitchen. I started to wonder if I was the only one holding on to the past, or if we were all in our own way pretending. One small comfort came from Mrs. Patel at the bakery. She noticed the shadows under my eyes and began slipping notes into my muffin bag, short messages, like, "You're doing better than you think," or "It's okay to be sad." Those small acts of kindness felt like secret lifelines, reminders that someone was rooting for me. I collected the notes in a shoebox under my bed, reading them on days when the house felt too quiet or the world too loud. Looking back, I realize now that I was caught between two worlds, the old life I missed and the new one I was trying to accept. It's a place a lot of people find themselves, especially after a big loss or change. The American way is to keep moving forward to show resilience and optimism, but sometimes what you really need is permission to pause and just feel. No one told me that it was normal to miss what was gone, while also being curious about what might come next. I had to learn that lesson the slow, hard way. A turning point came during the holidays. Vanessa wanted to start new traditions, baking gingerbread, hosting an ugly sweater party, inviting neighbors I barely knew. I went along, plastering on a smile for the camera, but inside, I felt homesick for the old ways. On Christmas Eve, Vanessa suggested we write letters to the people we missed. I watched as she carefully addressed an envelope to her own mother who lived across the country. My father hesitated, then scribbled a note to my mom, folding it into a paper star. When it was my turn, I found myself writing a letter, not just to my mother, but to myself. A promise that it was okay to be sad to miss her, to be unsure about the future. That night, as we sat by the fireplace, something shifted. Vanessa placed her letter on the mantel and squeezed my hand, not saying a word. My father rested his arm around my shoulders, humming the same lullaby my mother once sang. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, proof that new beginnings don't have to erase old memories. They can sit side by side, making room for both sorrow and joy. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that families are built, not born. The strongest ones are those that allow for honesty and vulnerability, that recognize the value of both holding on and letting go. It's okay to admit you're struggling, even when everyone else seems to have moved on. And it's okay to be a work in progress. With every step, I was learning to be kinder to myself, to accept that healing doesn't happen overnight. As winter gave way to spring, the routines of our house shifted once more. Vanessa brought home seeds for a new garden, hoping to coax something fresh from the thawing earth. My father spent weekends sanding old furniture, mending what he could. And I slowly, cautiously began to imagine that maybe it was possible to belong in more than one story at a time. I didn't know it yet, but bigger changes were on the horizon. Challenges that would test everything I thought I knew about loyalty, courage, and the meaning of home. Every family has its own calendar of important days, birthdays, holidays, annual picnics, little rituals that give shape to the year. For me, spring had always meant school plays. I'd loved the theater since I was small, first watching from the audience, while my mother clapped and cheered, then eventually standing on stage myself, heart-pounding as the lights came up. That year, after months of feeling invisible, I was chosen to play the lead in our school's musical. It felt like a lifeline, a chance to be someone to reclaim a little piece of happiness that belonged only to me. I remember the day I got the part. My drama teacher, Mrs. Lake, handed me the script with a wink and said, "You earned this, Maddie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I ran home, practically flying up the steps, rehearsing the lines in my head, dreaming about opening night. For weeks, every spare moment was filled with rehearsals, laughter, and whispered encouragement from classmates. It was the first time since my mother passed that I felt something like true excitement. I wanted my dad to see me on stage, to be proud of the way I'd found my own spotlight again. But life, I was learning, had a way of complicating even the simplest joys. The same night as the play, Vanessa was hosting her annual charity gala, a glittering grown-up affair for the hospital board and local business leaders. She'd been planning it for months, fretting over guest lists and floral arrangements, determined to impress her new circle of friends. One afternoon, I found her at the dining room table, surrounded by color-coded seating charts. When I mentioned my opening night, she barely looked up from her phone. "That's lovely, sweetheart, but you'll need to come to the gala instead. The Richardsons will be there, and their son just got into Harvard. It's important for your future." I tried to protest, explaining how much the play meant to me. My father glanced between us, caught in the crossfire, then rested his hand on Vanessa's. "It's just a school performance," he said gently. "There will be others, Madeline. This is important for our family." I felt the air go out of the room. My voice faltered. The script slipped from my hands. I wanted to shout, to plead for someone to take my side, but instead I nodded quietly, excused myself, and climbed the stairs to my room. That night I curled up on my bed, the script pressed against my chest, and cried in a way I hadn't since my mother's funeral. There was a deep, raw ache, not just disappointment, but a sense of being unseen. I'd tried so hard to be the easy daughter to make things work, but this felt like a line had been crossed. In the quiet darkness, I wondered if anyone even noticed what I was giving up, or if I was simply becoming another fixture in Vanessa's perfect, curated life. If you've ever watched a dream slip away because someone else decided it wasn't valuable, you'll understand the frustration that followed. For so many kids in blended families, sacrifices become a silent currency, giving up one thing for the greater good, for peace, or simply to avoid conflict. I heard similar stories from friends. Holidays traded, birthday parties, missed favorite traditions shelved to make room for new partners, new siblings, new lives. In America, we like to talk about opportunity and choice, but sometimes the choices that matter most aren't really ours to make. The days leading up to the gala felt heavy. Vanessa bought me a new dress, soft blue silk with a matching clutch, and arranged for a hair appointment. I went through the motions, smiling for the mirror, practicing polite conversation, rehearsing answers to questions I knew I'd be asked by strangers. On the night of the event, I watched the other parents in the school parking lot cheering for their kids, arms full of flowers and playbills. I watched the stage through the window as my understudy took my place, her voice trembling with nerves, her parents beaming from the front row. I told myself I was being mature, that sometimes family meant putting others first, but it felt like erasing a part of myself just to keep the peace. At the gala, Vanessa introduced me to guests as our Maddie, smiling for photos and recounting my accomplishments in polished sound bites. I shook hands, answered questions about school, and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Inside, I counted the minutes until I could go home. My father looked proud, and Vanessa beamed at every compliment, but I felt like a supporting character in someone else's story. That night, lying in bed with my makeup still on, I replayed Mrs. Lake's words. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I promised myself quietly that next time I would fight harder for what mattered to me. Looking back, I see that moment as a turning point, not just in my relationship with Vanessa and my father, but in the way I understood myself. I learned that sometimes adults make decisions for children without realizing the cost. Sometimes they believe that connections and appearances matter more than passions or small dreams. But those dreams, however small, are the building blocks of self-worth. Sacrificing them again and again chips away at who you are until all that's left is the version of you that pleases everyone else. If there's a lesson I carry from that night, it's that compromise shouldn't always mean surrender. There is value in standing up for what you love, in protecting the fragile corners of your heart that make you who you are. Families, especially blended families, can become stronger by honoring each person's unique passions, even when it's inconvenient. It's not selfish to want your own happiness, it's a kind of bravery. In the weeks after the gala, I withdrew into myself. I did my homework, attended dinner parties, performed every chore Vanessa suggested. But I was quieter, more cautious, reluctant to trust that my hopes would be respected. I started writing in a journal, pouring my feelings onto the page, the sadness, the anger, the small flickers of hope that refused to die. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my story wasn't over. I might not have gotten to stand in the spotlight that spring, but there would be other chances. I just had to learn how to recognize them and how to fight for them when they appeared. And as the days grew longer, a restlessness began to build, a curiosity about what else my mother might have left behind. One rainy afternoon, searching for a sweater in the back of my closet, I discovered a box I hadn't noticed before. Tucked inside was my mother's old journal, a tiny silver key, and a note written in her elegant, familiar hand. My heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, the world felt full of hidden doors waiting to be opened. On the outside, the box looked ordinary worn cardboard taped at the edges, a little dust clinging to the lid. But in my hands, it was the weight of another world. I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor, sunlight falling through the blinds in thin stripes, and gently opened the box. There, beneath a folded sweater and a stack of birthday cards, was my mother's journal, bound in faded blue leather, her initials pressed into the corner. Next to it rested a tiny silver key, dangling from a piece of pale blue ribbon. My breath caught. Suddenly, all those stories about people finding messages from loved ones after they were gone felt less like fiction and more like a secret, meant just for me. The first thing I did was run my hand over the journal's cover, remembering how my mom used to write every night before bed. She said it helped her make sense of the day, putting the mess in order, she'd call it, with a smile that made me feel safe. Opening the journal, I found pages filled with her neat handwriting reflections on gardening, little notes about recipes she wanted to try, even jokes she heard at work. But as I read deeper, her entries shifted. The words grew heavier. There were questions she never voiced aloud, worries about my father's late nights entries, about changes in the air, and how sometimes even the sunniest rooms can feel cold. That night I read until my eyes burned. In the final pages, I found a note addressed directly to me. If you're reading this, Maddie, then I know you're searching for answers. There's something important. You need to find something I didn't have time to explain. The key in this box unlocks more than just a drawer. The next line included the address of a bank downtown, the name of a manager, and a plea to trust myself. My heart pounded. Was this just a mother's last attempt to comfort me, or was there truly something left unfinished? The next morning, nerves and curiosity knotted in my stomach. I caught the bus downtown. The bank's marble floors felt cold beneath my shoes as I stepped inside, clutching the key so tightly it left an imprint on my palm. The manager, a kind woman with kind eyes, smiled when I explained why I'd come. "Your mother said you might visit one day," she said softly, then led me to a quiet room behind the teller windows. The safe deposit box clicked open, and inside I found a folder thick with papers, a USB drive, and a letter with my name in familiar script. My hands shook as I read. The letter began with stories, memories of my childhood, her hopes for me, the things she loved most about our family. Then her tone grew serious. She described worries she'd had about my father's business dealings, about changes in his behavior and unexplained absences. She wrote about Vanessa, too, revealing that she'd known her before the rest of us, that their paths had crossed at my father's office, and that something about their friendship never felt quite right. What started as suspicion had grown into certainty, and realizing how vulnerable our family legacy was, my mother had started to gather evidence. At first I thought it must be a mistake. I remembered how kind my father could be, how much he'd seemed to love us. But the folder was full of details, photocopies of financial records, old emails, and a timeline of transactions that painted a very different picture from the one I'd grown up believing. My mother had traced strange movements of money names I didn't recognize and accounts that seemed to vanish and reappear in other places. She'd even hired a lawyer, someone she trusted from her own family, to safeguard what she called our future. It wasn't just about the money, I realized. It was about trust. There's something uniquely painful about discovering that your safe place wasn't as safe as you thought. It's a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I know I'm not alone. I've heard stories at school online from friends about families unraveling over secrets, inheritances, or betrayals. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never expect. It doesn't mean the good times weren't real or that love was a lie. It just means that people are complicated, and sometimes their mistakes have deep roots. For a few days, I didn't know what to do. I carried the folder home, hiding it in my closet, and replayed every memory of my parents, searching for signs I might have missed. I thought about Mrs. Patel, who once told me, "Sometimes we don't see the storm until it's already overhead." I tried to act normal at dinner, answering Vanessa's questions and listening to my dad's stories, but inside I was reeling. The world felt upside down. I wrote in my own journal, trying to process what I'd learned, part of me angry, part of me heartbroken, and another part quietly determined not to let this new knowledge drown me. The lesson, I think, is that truth doesn't always arrive as a comfort. Sometimes it upends everything. But knowing the truth, even when it's hard, is the first step toward taking back your power. My mother hadn't just left behind warnings, she'd left me a map, a way to protect what mattered, and to begin building something better. In a way, her courage was a gift I'd only just unwrapped. As spring deepened, I started to see my world with new eyes. I paid closer attention to conversations, noticed details in my father's work, and began reading books about finance and law subjects I'd once thought were only for adults. My mother had given me the tools. Now I had to learn how to use them. I realized that my story wasn't just about loss or betrayal, but about learning to ask hard questions and to fight for answers. I didn't know then how far those questions would take me, or how much I'd have to grow up in order to follow the trail my mother had left. But as I closed the journal and tucked the key into my pocket, I understood one thing. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with a quiet act of bravery, a choice to look for the truth, even when it hurts. I was ready, or at least as ready as I'd ever be, to step out of childhood and into a story that was suddenly my own to tell. And in the hush that followed, I felt my mother's presence more clearly than ever. A steady hand on my shoulder urging me forward, reminding me that even the darkest secrets can lead us back into the light. The days after I discovered my mother's journal were filled with a restless kind of energy. For the first time in what felt like years, I had something to do, something that was mine alone. I began researching the names in my mother's folder, quietly borrowing books from the library about trusts, inheritance, and basic law. Each page I turned felt like another brick in a foundation I hadn't realized I was building. I watched the world at home differently, seeing connections and motives where before I'd seen only routine. I kept my questions to myself, but wrote everything down, determined not to lose a single thread. But soon I realized I couldn't do it all on my own. My mother had mentioned someone in her letter, a lawyer she trusted. Her name was Eleanor Blake, a friend from college who specialized in estate law. One afternoon, with trembling hands, I dialed the number my mom had left and introduced myself. "I was hoping you could help me understand something my mom left behind," I said, heart pounding. Eleanor's voice was calm and reassuring. She didn't press for details, but listened carefully, promising to meet me somewhere quiet and safe. It was the first time I'd shared my secret with anyone, and just saying the words aloud was like taking a deep breath after being underwater. We met in a small cafe across town. Eleanor arrived with a stack of notepads and an air of gentle authority. She asked me to tell her everything, and I did, halting at first, then, with growing confidence as she nodded and took notes. She never made me feel young or foolish. Instead, she treated me like someone with important information, someone worth believing. That small act of respect gave me courage. Eleanor explained what a trust was, how inheritance laws worked, and what kinds of evidence might be needed to protect what my mother intended for me. She also gave me practical advice. Keep records, make copies, trust my instincts, and never confront anyone alone. It was comforting to know I wasn't entirely on my own, but Eleanor also warned me that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. In families, money and power can make people behave in ways you'd never expect, she said quietly. I thought about all the stories I'd heard from classmates, arguments over houses, step-siblings who became rivals, parents who said hurtful things in the heat of conflict. The key, Eleanor continued, is to build a team you can trust. No one fights these battles alone, and you shouldn't have to either. For the first time, the idea of asking for help didn't feel like weakness. It felt like wisdom. Back at school, I started noticing which adults truly listened. Mrs. Lake, my drama teacher, had always made time for me even before I landed the lead in the school play. After rehearsal one day, I stayed behind and told her that things at home were more complicated than they seemed. I didn't share all the details, but enough for her to understand. She gave me her email, reminded me that her door was always open, and didn't push for more than I was ready to give. Her kindness made the burden lighter, and I realized that allies can come from unexpected places, a gentle nudge I wish every young person could receive. I also learned to be cautious. There's a difference between trusting someone and telling everyone your secrets. It's a lesson many teenagers in blended families face, figuring out who's safe, who will listen without judgment, and who might have their own agenda. At a sleepover, my friend Brian told me how he confided in his aunt after his parents' divorce. She didn't try to fix everything he said. She just told me that families get messy sometimes, but you don't have to pick up all the pieces alone. Hearing that made me realize that help isn't always dramatic. It can be as simple as someone who lets you be honest about what hurts. The more I learned from Eleanor and Mrs. Lake, the more I craved knowledge. I spent weekends researching legal terms, mapping out the connections my mother had uncovered. It felt overwhelming at times, but every new skill made me feel a little less powerless. There's something empowering about learning how the world works, especially when you feel outmatched. I began to see my father and Vanessa not just as parents, but as adults with flaws, choices, and secrets of their own. A lesson that stands out from those days is the importance of preparation. Movies make it seem like big moments arrive with dramatic music and speeches, but the truth is, real change comes from small steps, gathering facts, building alliances, practicing what you'll say when the time is right. It's not glamorous, but it's what makes the difference between acting on impulse and acting with purpose. Eleanor called it quiet courage, the kind that doesn't need applause. As spring turned to summer, my confidence grew. Eleanor introduced me to John Mathers, a retired judge who'd worked with my mother's family for years. He was thoughtful, patient, and full of stories about navigating tough situations. He taught me how to ask questions in ways that got real answers, how to read between the lines of legal documents, and how to stay calm even when people tried to intimidate me. Knowledge is your armor, Madeline, he'd say, and your compassion is your sword. I wrote that down in my journal, letting the words sink in. Every step I took made me feel closer to my mother. She'd left me a puzzle, yes, but she'd also left a trail of people who cared, people who believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. I thought of her planting seeds in the garden, trusting that flowers would bloom long after she was gone. That, too, was a lesson. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that prepare you for challenges you can't yet see. As summer unfolded, I became more observant, listening to conversations at the dinner table, noting changes in my father's mood, and quietly tracking new developments at home. Vanessa seemed busier than ever planning parties and meetings, talking on the phone late into the night. My father, for his part, looked tired, haunted almost by worries I could only guess at. I kept my distance, focusing on my research, and waited for the right moment to act. But change, I soon discovered, has a way of arriving all at once. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Vanessa and my father, a whispered argument about money reputation, and what she doesn't know won't hurt her. My heart pounded as I realized that the time for quiet preparation was ending. The truth was closer than ever to the surface, and I would need every bit of courage, support, and knowledge I'd gathered to face what came next. There are moments in every life that seem to gather all the days before them. Moments, even as they're unfolding, will divide everything into a before and an after. For me, that moment arrived on Mother's Day in the form of a carefully planned family gathering that was meant to celebrate new beginnings. Vanessa called it our first real Mother's Day as a family. She organized every detail: brunch in the garden, fresh-cut peonies on every table, even matching pastel dresses for us both. There would be photos for social media, smiling guests, and an announcement that she was officially petitioning to adopt me. On the surface, it was meant to be a joyful day, a kind of debut for the new Carter family. But underneath, I felt the old ache, the sense that the home I once knew had been repainted in colors that weren't my own. All week, I prepared a gift for Vanessa, something special. She thought something to symbolize our fresh start. What she didn't know was that my gift wasn't a bouquet or a card, but a carefully assembled album. Every document my mother had saved, every note, every clue I'd collected over the past months. I organized it page by page: family photos, legal records, timelines, highlighted statements, even screenshots from financial accounts. The cover was simple blue, like my mother's journal, with a gold-embossed thank you. It was in every way the most honest gift I had ever given. The morning of the party dawned bright and warm, the backyard humming with the energy of caterers and arriving guests. Vanessa fussed over details, barely pausing to eat her nerves on edge. My father was unusually quiet, checking his watch, pacing the living room. I put on my dress, brushed my hair, and rehearsed what I would say if things went wrong. My team, Eleanor, Judge Mathers, even Mrs. Lake, were on call, ready to step in if the situation turned ugly. The safety net helped, but my hands still shook as I carried the blue album into the garden. When it came time for presents, Vanessa sat with me on the patio swing. Guests gathered around their phones out for photos. "This is for you," I said, my voice calm but firm. She looked surprised, then pleased, expecting a sentimental scrapbook. Her expression changed as she flipped through the first few pages. Her smile faltered, her fingers tightening on the edges. By the time she reached the legal documents and flagged transfers, her hands began to tremble. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the laughter in the yard. My father leaned over to look confusion, turning quickly to alarm as he recognized his own signatures. I spoke quietly, so only they could hear. "I know everything. About the money, the trust, the business, and how it was all moved behind my back. I know about the legal papers Mom prepared. I know about your plan for today, too." Vanessa's face drained of color. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, as if on cue, the wind shifted, and the party noises faded into the background. It was just the three of us, with truth sitting heavy in the space between. The moments that followed felt slow and surreal. Vanessa tried to regain composure, insisting the documents couldn't possibly mean what they looked like. My father attempted to hush the conversation, casting anxious glances at the guests. But the evidence was clear, and for the first time, the power in our family dynamic shifted. I felt taller, steadier, not just a child, but someone who had inherited her mother's resolve. I explained carefully that everything had been reviewed by legal experts, that the trust was protected, and that any attempt to challenge it would only invite further investigation. If this sounds dramatic, it's because it was. But I've since learned that many families, especially those with complicated histories, reach a similar reckoning. Perhaps not at a garden party, but in a lawyer's office or a hospital room, or simply at the dinner table when secrets can't be hidden anymore. The moment the truth is spoken, there is no going back to the old normal. And while the world doesn't always give us perfect justice, sometimes it gives us the chance to reclaim our own story. The lesson I learned that day was simple but profound: honesty, even when it shakes the ground beneath you, is a form of self-respect. For so long, I'd been afraid that telling the truth would destroy what was left of my family. In reality, it was the lies layer upon layer that had built a house no one could truly live in. By shining a light on the past, I was making space for something new to grow. That kind of bravery doesn't come from anger or revenge, but from the quiet certainty that you deserve to be heard. As the party drew to a close, Vanessa retreated to her room, and my father followed, leaving me alone in the garden among the peonies. Guests wandered off confused by the sudden tension, unaware of the earthquake that had just shaken our family's foundation. I felt relief, fear, and a deep, aching sadness because even victories, when they come, carry a cost. Later, my father returned, his face older, his voice softer. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said. "Things will be different now." I nodded, knowing he was right, but also that different would mean harder choices for us all. That evening, I called Eleanor and Judge Mathers to share what had happened. They were proud, but also reminded me that there was still work to do. "You took the first step," Madeline Eleanor said. "Now comes the part where you decide what happens next." The sense of finality was real, but so was a new sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, I was not just reacting to other people's plans, I was making my own. And so as dusk settled and the garden lights flickered on, I realized that truth is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The days ahead would bring challenges, legal battles, difficult conversations, and the task of rebuilding not just a family, but my own sense of trust. But I felt my mother's spirit with me, strong, steady, and unafraid. The day after Mother's Day, the house felt like a stage after the curtains had closed, a little too quiet, a little too full of echoes. I woke to sunlight spilling across the covers for a moment, forgetting everything that had happened. But as soon as I opened my door, the hush pressed in heavy with all the words left unspoken the night before. Vanessa's heels were missing from their usual place by the stairs. My father's office door was closed, locked from the inside. I made myself breakfast, hands steady, even as my mind raced. The truth was out now, and we were all left to live with it. Later that morning, my father asked to see me in his office. The space, once filled with tidy stacks of papers and photos from our vacations, felt smaller, like the walls themselves had drawn in. He sat behind the desk, his face drawn and tired, as he slid a stack of legal papers across to me. "These are the documents your mother left," he said, his voice strained. "The lawyers say it's all in order. The company that trusts your name is everywhere. There was no more denial, no more dodging. The evidence was too strong." For the first time, I saw him not just as a parent, but as a man facing the consequences of choices made long ago. Transitions of power rarely happen overnight, and rarely without pain. Over the next few weeks, our home became a crossroads for lawyers, financial advisors, and family friends who drifted in and out with solemn faces and clipped conversations. I met with Eleanor and Judge Mathers, reviewing every detail of the trust and the family business. It felt surreal, me, 16, sitting at a conference table, discussing mergers, legacy contracts, and contingency plans. I'd studied, prepared, and listened, but nothing truly gets you ready for the weight of real decisions. Every meeting was a lesson in what it means to take responsibility, not just for yourself, but for something larger, something inherited and fragile. The real world isn't a storybook, and justice doesn't mean that everything broken will suddenly be made whole. Vanessa moved out quietly, leaving a short note on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I hope one day you'll understand." I didn't feel triumph as I watched her go, just a complicated mix of relief, sadness, and strange pity. She had tried to build a place for herself in our family, but in doing so had lost her own way. My father remained, but the air between us was changed. He apologized not in grand speeches, but in the awkward, halting way that people do when they finally see the damage done. He offered to step back to let me lead to make amends, not just in words, but in actions. During this time, I found strength in unexpected places. My friend Julia came over one afternoon with a bag of cookies and a listening ear. "You did what you had to do," she said, simply, not asking for details, just holding space for me to feel what I needed. Mrs. Patel at the bakery handed me an extra muffin for courage, pressing it into my palm with a knowing smile. Even Mrs. Lake, my drama teacher, checked in with encouraging notes, reminding me that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up day after day. If you've ever stepped into a new role before you felt ready, you'll know the strange mixture of fear and hope that comes with it. I made mistakes, small ones at first, like forgetting to answer an important email or stumbling over business terms in front of my mother's former colleagues. But every stumble became a lesson, and every lesson was a step forward. The world didn't expect much from a teenager inheriting a company, and in a way that gave me freedom. I didn't have to pretend to be perfect, just willing to learn. Eleanor once told me, "No one ever leads alone. The smartest leaders listen more than they speak." That advice carried me through the early months, reminding me to ask questions, to listen to the wisdom of those who came before me, and to trust my own instincts when it mattered most. Leadership isn't about power or prestige, it's about stewardship. I realized that what my mother had left me wasn't just a fortune, but a responsibility to protect the people who depended on our company, to honor the values she cherished, to rebuild trust where it had been lost. It was humbling and sometimes overwhelming. But as I met the employees who remembered my mother's kindness, as I heard stories of her honesty and care, I began to understand that leadership could also be a kind of healing. The company, much like our family, needed time to recover, to adjust, to believe in something new. I also learned that moving forward meant letting go of certain things. Our old house, with all its memories and shadows, began to feel less like a home and more like a chapter closing. My father and I discussed selling it, choosing instead a smaller place closer to the city, a space where we could build new routines free from the weight of what had been. The decision was hard, but ultimately freeing. Sometimes letting go is the bravest act of all. A real-life example of this kind of change played out in my own circle. Julia's stepfather, after years of tension, chose to step back and let her mother run the family business, a choice that led not to resentment, but to a stronger relationship built on mutual respect. Stories like ours aren't rare. Across the country, families navigate the messy, sometimes beautiful process of rediscovering themselves after loss or betrayal. It isn't easy, but it is possible. The lesson that grew from those months is one I carry still. Leadership, real leadership, is about showing up with honesty and humility. It's about learning from your mistakes, forgiving yourself and others, and believing that something good can still come from broken places. I learned to trust the team my mother had built, to find my own voice, and to accept help when I needed it. Above all, I learned that healing takes time and that the first step is always the hardest. As summer ripened, I found myself waking up not with dread, but with something closer to hope. There were still difficult days, moments when the enormity of what I'd inherited felt too much to bear. But little by little, the company found its footing, and so did I. My father and I learned to talk again this time, as equals sharing burdens instead of hiding them. I found solace in routine and friends, in the quiet moments when the past felt less like a weight and more like a guide. I didn't know what the future held. But as I watched the sun set over the city from our new apartment window, I realized that the story I was living was no longer just about what I'd lost. It was about what I was building day by day with patience, courage, and the memory of my mother's steady hand. And as I stood there on the edge of something new, I knew that the work of healing and of leading had only just begun. Forgiveness is a word we hear often, but living it out is a quieter, messier journey. In the months after our family's reckoning, I thought justice would be enough. I believed that setting things right, restoring the trust, protecting the company moving out of the old house would fill the empty spaces left behind. But as the first excitement faded, a softer ache remained, the realization that even when you win, loss leaves its own kind of scar. I'd spent so long preparing for a confrontation that I didn't know what to do with the quiet that came after. It turns out healing isn't about forgetting what happened, but about making peace with it. My father and I were learning to talk to each other in a new way. Gone was the old careful politeness. There were awkward pauses, hard questions, even arguments about the past. Some days I wanted to be close to him, and other days I needed space. We took long walks through our new neighborhood, sharing stories and silences. One evening he admitted, "I was afraid of losing you too. I made mistakes, Madeline. I should have listened." His voice cracked, and I realized that forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone once. It's something you practice over and over as you both learn to trust again. There were moments when I found myself thinking about Vanessa, wondering where she'd gone and what her life looked like now. I never got a letter, and we didn't stay in touch. But sometimes while walking past the city gardens she once admired, I found myself wishing her peace, hoping she could find a fresh start free from the mistakes that had driven us apart. Real forgiveness, I discovered, isn't about excusing harm or inviting someone back into your life. It's about letting go of the power their actions have over your heart. That release made space for something softer to grow. During this time, I leaned on my friends more than ever. Julia, whose own family had gone through storms and reconciliations, listened without judgment. "You know," she said one afternoon, as we watched the rain streak down her window, "sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're still hurting, even after everything is supposed to be fixed." She shared how, after her stepfather's apology, she still felt pangs of anger sometimes, and that was okay. The point, she said, was to keep choosing connection even on the hard days. At school, I became less focused on being perfect and more interested in being real. I talked openly with Mrs. Lake about my struggles, and she encouraged me to join a peer support group. There, I met other teens whose families had splintered and reformed, each with their own wounds and victories. We learned from each other not just how to survive hard times, but how to grow from them. One boy shared how volunteering at a local animal shelter helped him process his grief. Another girl described finding solace in painting. Hearing their stories reminded me that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It's a communal act, a patchwork made stronger by each person's contribution. As I settled into my new routines, I found comfort in giving back. I started tutoring younger students who struggled with reading, remembering how lost I'd felt after my mom died. I volunteered at community gardens, planting wildflowers in neglected corners, each seed a small act of hope. I even helped organize a fundraiser for families in transition-blended foster or otherwise, because I knew firsthand how hard it could be to rebuild from the ground up. These acts didn't erase the pain, but they gave it purpose, turning my scars into stepping stones for someone else. If there's a lesson I want to share from this chapter of my life, it's this: forgiveness and healing aren't the same as forgetting. You don't have to deny what happened or pretend the past didn't matter. Instead, you learn to hold your story with tenderness, honoring both the brokenness and the beauty. You give yourself permission to feel it all: anger, sadness, gratitude, hope, and in doing so, you make room for joy to return. One afternoon, as autumn colored the trees outside our apartment, my father and I visited my mother's grave together for the first time. We brought sunflowers, her favorite, and stood in silence as the wind stirred around us. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said quietly, his hand trembling in mine. I smiled, feeling the truth of it, not just for me, but for both of us. We had made it through a storm neither of us chose, and on the other side we'd found not a perfect ending, but a new beginning. On the way home, we stopped at the bakery. Mrs. Patel greeted us with a knowing nod and a box of warm muffins. For strength, she said, her eyes crinkling with kindness. As we walked back through the busy city streets, the world felt a little more welcoming, the burdens a little lighter. I knew there would still be hard days, moments when old wounds ached, and memories surfaced unexpectedly. But I also knew deep down that I wasn't alone anymore. The bonds we forge in the aftermath of hardship are different than the ones we're born with. They're tempered by truth, by the willingness to stay and do the work of healing. As I moved forward, I found myself less afraid of what might come next. The pain that once defined me became just one part of a much larger story, a story I was learning to shape one day, one act of kindness at a time. And as the last leaves fell from the trees, I realized I was ready to live with hope again, to open myself to new dreams, and to honor the legacy my mother left, not by holding on to pain, but by building something beautiful out of it. The final chapter wasn't about endings at all. It was about the courage to begin again. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how far I've come from that quiet girl huddled under her mother's quilt, searching for answers in the dark. My story began with loss, then wove its way through years of quiet survival, silent battles, and hidden truths. I learned that families are not just born, they're built sometimes from broken pieces, stitched together with effort, forgiveness, and the courage to face the hard things head-on. I saw how grief doesn't disappear, but it can be transformed just like an old garden after winter, when new green pushes bravely through the soil. Through every chapter, I discovered that healing rarely happens all at once. It's slow, sometimes invisible, made up of small choices to ask for help, to be honest about pain, to forgive even when it hurts, and to reach for hope. The anger and fear that once defined me became fuel for change, guiding me to claim my voice and protect what mattered most. My mother's legacy was never just the trust or the family business. It was the strength she passed to me, the example she set, and the reminder that telling the truth is always an act of love. I learned that justice isn't always neat or complete, but it's worth fighting for. I saw firsthand that leadership is not about having all the answers, but about listening deeply, making mistakes, and getting back up. When I stumbled, friends like Julia, mentors like Eleanor, and the quiet kindness of people like Mrs. Patel reminded me that none of us are alone, no matter how lonely the road sometimes feels. Each small act of support became a stepping stone, leading me back to myself and forward into something new. My relationship with my father changed too, not into something perfect, but into something real. We learned to apologize, to ask for space to show up even when it was uncomfortable. In those hard-won moments, I saw how forgiveness can bridge the widest gaps and how rebuilding trust is a practice, not a promise. Vanessa, for her part, faded into the distance, a reminder that sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is let people go and wish them peace. What I carry now is the belief that everyone has a story worth telling, even if it's messy, unfinished, or full of shadows. We all carry scars, visible or hidden, but we also carry the power to shape what comes next. If you've ever felt invisible, excluded, or powerless, know that your story matters. You are not alone. And sometimes when you least expect it, the things you survive become the roots of your greatest strength. So as my journey continues, I choose to honor my past by giving back, by listening to others, by sharing what I've learned, and by planting seeds of hope wherever I can. I hope you'll do the same in your own life, however small those acts may seem. Healing is a collective effort. We need each other's courage, patience, and gentle reminders that it's okay to begin again and again. If my story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own resilience, I invite you to join this community. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your story, and give this video a like so it can reach others who might need to hear these words. Every time you share, comment, or simply listen, you help create a circle of support for people who are searching for belonging, just as I once was. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that no matter where you start, you can always choose to write a new chapter. Until next time, remember, healing is possible. Family is what we build, and your voice, quiet or loud, deserves to be heard.